So top with the Sawa Israelis at the border near Lebanon have evacuated their houses. This comes as Israel expanded planned evacuations of communities on its northern front with Lebanon yesterday, as Hezbollah and Israel have been trading fire at the frontier with increasing frequency since the 7th of October. Meanwhile, at least 5,087 Palestinians have also been killed in Israeli strikes since that day. It's according to Gaza's health ministry. Now, families with children were seen fleeing the Sheikh Radwan neighborhood of Gaza City after an Israeli strike hit the area. More than 1 million people used to live in the north of the Gaza Strip. Now, hundreds of thousands have gone southwards to cram into temporary refuges despite unremitting air and artillery strikes that also hit the southern areas that they fled to. Fears are mounting that the Israel-Hamas conflict could mushroom into a wider Middle East conflict. Right, so for more, let's bring in news correspondent Cullen for the latest in Tel Aviv, Israel. Ross, good afternoon. SA time, of course. Perhaps you could bring us the latest on your end as we speak on the back of the peace summit that also transpired.
Yes, we have seen an increase in the activity in the north of the country. There have been further anti-tank missiles, mortars and rockets fired by Hezbollah positions in southern Lebanon into northern Israel. So Israel has been carrying out strikes on those positions. Hezbollah have confirmed one of their fighters has died, and there were some injuries as well, wounded sustained by Israeli defense forces. Israel has also been evacuating towns and villages in the north of the country, moving those people away from potentially harm's way as the situation in the north becomes more tense. Hezbollah, which is a militant group backed by Iran, based in Lebanon, is said to be stronger than Hamas in terms of its fighters and its weaponry. And so that is one of the reasons why we have seen such an effort by particularly Western leaders calling for the conflict to spread no further than Israel and Hamas. There have been regular calls, regular tours of the region by Joe Biden, Antony Blinken, Rishi Sunak. We've heard Emmanuel Macron as well call ahead of his trip here on Tuesday for the conflict not to spread, for other actors like Iran or non-state actors like Hezbollah not to get involved. And so that's the situation in the north. In the south, continuing to see military build up around the Gaza border. We have seen more than 400 people die in just 24 hours, according to the Palestinian authorities. The Gaza Health Ministry saying that the numbers now are more than 5,000 people have died in the Gaza Strip since the start of the Israeli bombing campaign, which began itself on October the 7th in retaliation for the atrocities committed here inside Israel by Hamas. More than 15,000 people have been injured in that bombing campaign so far.
Ross, thank you for that update. Perhaps as we see the increase in the rise of protests the world over, civil society at large coming together to stand in solidarity, both pro-Israel and pro-Palestine at this point. From your vantage point, what message is being communicated? How is that also impacting dynamics? And if we look at the role of the BDS movement, has that had any effect to date?
We are seeing major demonstrations over the weekend. There was the first legally authorised pro-Palestine demonstration in France, for example. There had previously been demonstrations which had tried to go ahead where it hadn't been fully authorised. We've seen major demonstrations in London as well in favour of support for the Palestinian people. And we've also seen demonstrations in favour of Israel, supporting the Jewish people and showing that outrage, that condemnation at the atrocities committed here inside Israel by Hamas on the 7th of October. We have seen demonstrations outside Israel, but also inside Israel. There have been some protests here in Tel Aviv calling for the government to do more, calling for there to be more accountability for how this happened in the first place, and calling for even further action, asking why politicians are not moving faster to negotiate the release of all the hostages currently being held inside the Gaza Strip. Those people were abducted from here inside Israel as part of the Hamas attacks on the 7th of October. They include Israeli citizens, non-Israelis, including some French, German and American and Thai nationals as well, civilians and also members of Israel's armed forces currently being held captive by Hamas in the Gaza Strip.
Ross, whilst I have you on the line, perhaps as we conclude, as time goes by, of course, time is also running out. On the back of the peace summit that was concluded in Egypt, one day, but obviously just looking at some of the initiatives, how has this been received?
Well, the United States sent a junior diplomat to that summit in Cairo on Saturday. Iran didn't have any representatives. Israel didn't have any representatives. So in terms of the wider region, you're not including Iran, as I say, who are backing Hezbollah and to an extent back Hamas. You're not including Israel, which suffered the attack and which is now carrying out a relentless bombing campaign of the Gaza Strip and putting some restrictions on the aid that comes in. You're not including the United States to any major extent, the military backer, that firm ally which has said it will support Israel today, tomorrow and every day. So in terms of achieving any lasting resolutions to the political process, any lasting resolutions to the military conflict that's going on, any lasting resolutions in terms of a humanitarian pause or a ceasefire, it was going to always be very hard without those three countries, those three major players coming to the table in terms of that agreement. So we did have the United Nations Secretary General even that high. Without those players of the United States, Israel and Iran, it was always going to be difficult. So there were calls for that ceasefire, there were calls for the humanitarian pauses, and at the moment we have a complicated situation in the Gaza Strip because we have currently a third aid convoy, two coming in on Saturday and Sunday, now the third one here on Monday, coming in at a time when there is ongoing negotiation about releasing hostages and this possibility, highly expected, ground incursion by Israel, which could well include infantry and tanks at the time when you have trucks from the aid agencies trying to drive around the Gaza Strip delivering assistance to the people who need it.
Ross, thank you for that update. We'll leave that conversation there for now. Correspondent, in fact, Ross Cullen, bring us the latest in Tel Aviv, Israel, as we shine a spotlight on the Israel-Hamas conflict that's obviously underway. Staying with our coverage, though, we've seen the United States has proposed a UN Security Council draft resolution condemning Hamas for the October 7th attack on Israel, whilst reaffirming the latter's right to defend itself. So the resolution, introduced after two earlier failed efforts on a humanitarian ceasefire by Russia and humanitarian pauses by Brazil, respectively, also urges member states to take practical steps to prevent the export of arms and materials to armed militia and terrorist groups operating in Gaza, including Hamas. So for the latest on this resolution and other issues, we're going to speak to our UN Correspondent Sherwin Bryce-Pease, who joins us live from New York. Sherwin, good afternoon, South African time. Thank you for joining us. Perhaps you could give us a broad overview of the resolution and a sense of whether it can pass where two previous resolutions on humanitarian access, in fact, have failed.
Well, Liesl, that's the kicker right there at the end of that question, right? We've had two resolutions put to the Security Council. One first by Russia that called for an immediate humanitarian ceasefire. That failed, didn't get the minimum required of votes for a resolution to pass. So that didn't pass. Then you had Brazil's effort, which of course was vetoed by the United States, despite 12 member states in favor of that resolution that essentially called for humanitarian pauses. So cue the United States now that feels it's its turn to put a draft resolution on the table. And this is what they are seeking to achieve here. They want to unequivocally reject and condemn the heinous terrorist attack by Hamas on October 7th. That was also included in the Brazilian draft. It strongly urges full respect and compliance with obligations under international law. You've heard various UN officials, the Secretary General in particular, talk about the need to uphold law, essentially the need to protect civilians and protect civilian infrastructure. It also demands the immediate and unconditional release of hostages. We've seen that in previous resolutions. It calls for all necessary measures to allow for full, rapid and safe and unhindered humanitarian access according to international humanitarian law. So it's not essentially calling for a humanitarian ceasefire per se, but certainly language in that vein. It also calls on member states to further support the efforts of the UN, Egypt and Jordan and others to build on the important steps we saw at the weekend in terms of humanitarian aid finally entering Gaza. We saw a second convoy of 14 trucks welcomed by the United Nations late last night. It also emphasizes that civilian and humanitarian facilities, including things like hospitals, schools and the like, should not be targeted in those airstrikes that we have seen since October 7th in Gaza. And then, Liesl, it also calls on all states and international organizations to intensify urgent concrete steps to support the UN agencies and various international partners in preventing this conflict from spilling over into a wider conflagration here. You've just been hearing from our colleague in the region reports of exchanges of fire on Israel's northern border with Lebanon. There are also reports of strikes on Damascus Airport, Aleppo Airport in Syria. So a big concern in terms of this resolution, also in terms of preventing this this conflict from escalating into a regional conflict.
Well, Sherwin, speaking of efforts, the UN has welcomed the passage of 2 humanitarian aid convoys into Gaza so far. And in what the UN humanitarian chief, Martin Griffiths, has called a small glimmer of hope, is this something that can now be expected to break the Israeli siege that has been in place since the Hamas attacked on the 7th of October?
Yeah, a real drop in the ocean is what the United Nations has really called the aid that has made it into Gaza so far. We had 20 trucks, I think, on Saturday, and then 14 trucks last night. And of course, you know, there are 2 million people plus Palestinians that haven't had access to essential services, water, fuel, food, medical supplies, hospitals running on the bare minimum, essentially, given the level of need in terms of the casualties that have been inflicted on this population as a result of those Israeli airstrikes. So a great deal of concern from the United Nations. They've called for an unequivocal humanitarian ceasefire. That, of course, is not contained in the language of this resolution, but certainly the pressure now on for this humanitarian, this trickle of aid that has managed to make it into Gaza, for it to be expanded and to continue. And a glimmer of hope, speaking to what Martin Griffiths says, is what we see in a statement that was released by the White House over the weekend after a call between President Joe Biden and Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu of Israel. It says the president welcomed the first 2 convoys of humanitarian assistance since the terrorist attack, which crossed the border into Gaza and is being distributed to Palestinians in need. And this is the important part of the statement, Liesl. The leaders affirmed that there will now be continued flow of this critical assistance into Gaza. So it kind of feeds into what the United States is trying to do in terms of that resolution at the United Nations. They are now saying that the aid into Gaza will continue. The permutations of that are not clear. The logistics of that are not clear. But it certainly provides a window of opportunity here for this aid to be escalated, to be augmented, and certainly to continue into the days and weeks ahead.
Well, from the efforts underway to the concerns that arise, there's some growing concerns about the ground offensive into Gaza, the expansion of this conflict into a regional one, with clashes on Israel's border with Lebanon and Syria. I mean, it has intensified over the weekend. And so from your vantage point, what are you hearing on that front?
Yeah, there are 2 issues here. Essentially, you have, on the one hand, Israel's right to defend itself. UN Charter Article 51 makes that clear. Israel has that right, and it's contained in the language in that UN Security Council resolution. But how does that meet the need for humanitarian aid and the desperate need of Gazan civilians, Palestinians in the main, who require that desperately needed aid? And how can the 2 coexist together? Some would say probably not very well. And so the concern here is certainly from the United States. We're hearing there's a New York Times report out this morning that says the Biden administration has advised Israel to delay its so as to allow more opportunity for hostage negotiations to continue. We saw some low-hanging fruit over the weekend, just into the weekend, with the release of those 2 American hostages, welcomed broadly by the international community due to the negotiating efforts, the contacts between Qatar and Hamas. And so the United States really seeing a window of opportunity in that regard, wanting to open the space for continued negotiations, and recognizing that Israel's ground offensive might hamper those efforts. They're not demanding that Israel not pursue this ground offensive, but they're saying, let's go slowly into this so that we, create the best scenario here in terms of the release of those hostages. And given that 2 people were released on humanitarian grounds into this weekend, there's now a glimmer of hope in that regard that more hostages can be released. But certainly a ground offensive at this moment will probably hamper those efforts.
Sherwin, thank you very much for your time with us. Of course, our correspondent Sherwin Bryce-Pease joining us live from New York. Just really weighing in on the latest. We know that the United States proposing a UN Security Council draft resolution condemning Hamas for the 7th of October attack on Israel, whilst reaffirming the latter's right to defend itself. So we're obviously looking at developments from here into and really how the conflict is going to escalate. Perhaps also looking at where to from here, given the impact it's going to be having on the regions and geopolitical landscape at large. Again, thank you to Sherwin for that update.